At 6 a.m., Thomas Mitchell was scrubbing the marble floors of the 47th floor when the elevator doors sliced open. Victoria Sterling stormed out, her designer heels striking the marble like gunshots, her face blazing with fury that could incinerate steel. "What are you doing here?" Her voice cracked like a whip. Thomas slowly straightened, his weathered hand still gripping the mop. "Cleaning, Mom." "You're fired. Get out, now!" The words exploded from her lips. As Thomas bent to retrieve his fallen pocket watch, the silent reminder of Sarah's love that had stopped ticking the day she died, a phone shrieked from behind Victoria's office door. Her commanding mask shattered. "Marcus, please! I can't keep doing this!" Her voice trembled with raw terror. What kind of monster had the heiress of an $18 billion empire so terrified that she'd destroy an innocent man's livelihood just to keep her secrets buried? Thomas Mitchell had worked as a janitor at Meridian Industries for 8 months, ever since Sarah's cancer had finally claimed her gentle soul. The 42-year-old former mechanical engineer found solace in the mindless repetition of cleaning, the way soap and water could make things spotless again. If only grief worked the same way. His calloused hands, once steady enough to design precision machinery, now trembled only when he thought about the medical bills that had consumed their savings. Every morning at 5:30, Thomas would kiss his 8-year-old son Jake goodbye as the boy slept in their cramped trailer. Jake often asked why Daddy had to work at night when other daddies came home for dinner. The pocket watch in his uniform had belonged to his grandfather, a railroad man who'd worked with his hands until the day he died. Sarah had found it in Thomas's childhood bedroom and spent weeks having it repaired as a surprise for their 5th wedding anniversary. "Time moves forward, my love," she'd whispered as she'd placed it in his palm. "But some things are worth carrying with us." The watch had kept perfect time for 3 years, until the morning Sarah drew her last breath. Then its hands had simply stopped, as if even time itself was mourning. Thomas carried it every day since, a silent reminder of promises kept and promises broken. Victoria Sterling controlled every circuit, every patent, every dollar of the $18 billion corporation that her adoptive father William Sterling had built from nothing. Thomas had never spoken to her before today. Janitors and CEOs lived in different worlds, separated by 46 floors and a lifetime of choices. But now, standing in the pristine hallway with his cleaning supplies scattered like the remnants of his dignity, Thomas realized even this small refuge was being torn away. Work had been his escape from grief, his purpose when everything else felt meaningless. What could terrify someone who controlled billions of dollars? And why had Victoria looked at him like she was seeing a ghost from a past she'd tried to bury? Thomas spent the next week haunting the employment offices of Millbrook, Connecticut, his resume growing more pathetic with each rejection letter. Former mechanical engineer, current janitor, recently fired for reasons he couldn't explain without sounding delusional. Not exactly the career trajectory that inspired confidence. Jake had started asking harder questions, his 8-year-old intuition picking up on the tension that radiated from his father like heat from a fever. "Did you get in trouble at work, Daddy?" the boy asked over their dinner of canned soup and crackers. Thomas smiled and lied with the practiced ease of a parent protecting his child from harsh realities. The trailer they called home felt smaller each day, its thin walls offering little protection from the Connecticut winter. On Tuesday night, Thomas found himself in the 24-hour grocery store at 2 a.m., staring at the prices of Jake's favorite cereal and calculating how many days they could stretch a single box. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look sick and desperate. That's when he saw her. Victoria Sterling stood in the pharmacy aisle, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled beyond recognition, her blonde hair escaping from what had once been a perfect chignon. She moved like someone who hadn't slept in days, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained. Her hands shook as she reached for a bottle of sleeping pills with the desperation of someone drowning in shallow water. When she turned and saw him, her face went white as fresh snow, her green eyes widening with something that looked like terror, mixed with recognition. For a moment they stared at each other across the fluorescent-lit aisle, the fired janitor and the billionaire heiress, both shopping for things they hoped would quiet the chaos in their heads. Victoria fumbled with her purse, her credit card slipping from trembling fingers and skittering across the linoleum floor like a wounded animal. Without thinking, Thomas bent to retrieve it, holding it out to her with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown Sarah during her worst days. His movements were slow and unthreatening, the body language of someone who understood what it meant to be broken. "I don't need help from someone I fired," she said quietly, her anger deflating into exhaustion that seemed to age her 10 years in 10 seconds. Thomas nodded understanding, his weathered face showing neither bitterness nor judgment. "No harm in returning what's yours," he said simply, and something in his tone, free of accusation, free of the desire for revenge, made Victoria's carefully constructed walls tremble. She took the card with unsteady fingers, studying his face as if trying to solve a puzzle that had been tormenting her for days. "You don't seem angry," she observed, suspicion and surprise warring in her voice. Thomas shrugged, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "Anger's a luxury I can't afford right now. Got more important things to worry about." The call came on Friday morning, while Thomas was teaching Jake how to scramble eggs without burning them, their small trailer kitchen filled with the domestic sounds of a father trying to create normalcy in the midst of chaos. Victoria Sterling's voice was different over the phone, smaller somehow, stripped of the imperial authority that had made her so terrifying in person. "Mr. Mitchell? This is Victoria Sterling from Meridian Industries. I have a proposition for you." Jake looked up from the stove with curious green eyes that reminded Thomas painfully of Sarah. He held up one finger, stepping into their tiny living room for privacy that their thin walls couldn't really provide. "I need someone to oversee security at some of our sensitive facilities," Victoria continued, her words careful and measured like someone walking through a minefield. "The pay is substantial, 5 times what you were earning before, but it requires absolute discretion and complete loyalty." Thomas frowned, staring out the trailer's small window at the Meridian Tower glinting in the distance like a glass monument to success he'd never achieve. The offer seemed too good to be true, which in his experience usually meant it was. "Why me?" he asked bluntly, cutting through whatever corporate doublespeak she was preparing to deploy. There was a long pause, filled with the static of a connection that seemed to stretch across more than just miles. "Because you have integrity," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she'd encountered precious little of that quality in her business dealings. "And because I need someone who won't ask questions they don't need to know the answers to." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Fired for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, now hired for the same quality of discretion. He thought about Jake's excited chatter about school projects, about the stack of unpaid bills on their kitchen table. "When do I start?" he asked, and he could hear her exhale in relief like she'd been holding her breath for hours. When Thomas hung up, Jake was standing in the doorway with a spatula in his hand and hope shining in his young eyes like sunlight through storm clouds. "Did you get a new job, Daddy?" The boy's voice carried the careful optimism of a child who'd learned not to expect too much, but couldn't quite stop himself from hoping anyway. Thomas knelt down to his son's level, studying the boy's face. Sarah's delicate features mixed with his own stubborn determination. "Maybe," Thomas said carefully, not wanting to promise something that might evaporate like morning dew. but it might mean some changes. Different schedule, different kind of work. Jake threw his arms around his father's neck with the fierce affection that children reserve for moments when the adult world suddenly makes sense again. As long as we're together. The boy whispered into Thomas's shoulder, and Thomas felt his heart crack open just a little. Not with grief this time, but with something that might eventually grow into hope. The facility Victoria had sent him to was nothing like the gleaming corporate headquarters where he'd once pushed a mop across marble floors. Tucked away in an industrial district 20 minutes outside of town, it looked like any other warehouse from the outside. Grey concrete walls, minimal signage, surrounded by a chain-link fence that was higher and more sophisticated than any normal business would need. But inside, Thomas discovered a technological wonderland that made his engineering background suddenly relevant again. Servers humming with the power of a small city, workstations displaying data streams that flowed like digital waterfalls. The air itself felt different here, charged with electronic potential and the weight of secrets that could reshape the world. Victoria met him at the facility's entrance, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the corporate queen he'd encountered before. She moved differently in this space, her stilted corporate persona giving way to something more natural and confident. She led him through corridors lined with equipment that hummed with barely contained energy, explaining his duties in a voice that grew more animated as she focused on technical details. This facility processes and stores critical data for all of Meridian's operations, she said, her fingers dancing across a control panel with practiced expertise. Most people don't even know it exists, and it needs to stay that way. As they walked deeper into the facility's electronic heart, Thomas began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Inconsistencies that his engineer's mind couldn't ignore. Victoria knew the facility too well for someone who'd supposedly inherited it just 6 months ago. She moved through the maze of equipment like someone who'd spent years learning every circuit and connection. Her hands bore small scars that spoke of practical work, with tools and machinery, not the soft skin of someone who'd spent her life in boardrooms. When she explained the server configurations, she used technical language that would have taken months to master. Her voice carried the passion of someone who genuinely understood and loved the technology she was describing. "You built this," Thomas said suddenly, stopping in front of a particularly complex array of processors that seemed to pulse with digital life. It wasn't a question but a statement of recognition. One engineer acknowledging another's masterwork. Victoria's step faltered, and she turned to face him with wariness replacing her earlier confidence, like a mask sliding back into place. "I designed some of the systems," she admitted carefully, as if the words themselves were dangerous weapons that could be turned against her. "Before I became CEO." But Thomas's engineering eye caught details she probably hoped he'd miss. The elegant efficiency of the design, the innovative cooling systems that solved problems he'd never even considered. "Who are you, really?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice free of accusation, but heavy with the kind of curiosity that had driven him to become an engineer in the first place. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: fear, calculation, and finally a kind of exhausted resignation that suggested she was tired of carrying secrets that were slowly crushing her. "Someone who's very good at keeping secrets," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And someone who desperately needs your help to keep them." She led him to a small office where monitoring screens displayed data streams in patterns that suggested the nervous system of something vast and alive. "The security isn't just about protecting equipment," Victoria explained, settling into a chair that faced the screens like a ship captain monitoring the horizon for storms. "It's about protecting people, families, livelihoods. If certain information ever became public, it wouldn't just destroy me. It would destroy 15,000 jobs and countless lives that depend on this company's success. Thomas studied her profile as she watched the data streams flow across multiple monitors, noting the way her jaw tightened with determination and her eyes held the weight of responsibilities too heavy for someone so young. The blue light from the screens painted her face in shifting patterns that made her look ethereal and fragile, like a ghost haunting her own creation. Something in her tone reminded him of Sarah during the worst days of her illness, the same desperate courage of someone fighting a battle they weren't sure they could win. "What kind of information?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair beside hers, close enough to see the strain lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Victoria was quiet for so long that he wondered if she'd answer at all, her fingers drumming against the desk with nervous energy. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying the words too loudly might make them real. The kind that could bring down an empire and destroy everyone connected to it. For 3 weeks, Thomas immersed himself in the rhythms of the facility, learning systems that were far more sophisticated than anything he'd encountered in his engineering career. Victoria visited daily, sometimes staying for hours to work alongside him, their conversations gradually shifting from purely professional to something more personal and intimate. She asked about Jake with genuine interest, listening to stories about the boy's school projects and his passion for building things with his hands. In return, she shared fragments of her own story, growing up without parents in a series of foster homes, being taken in by William Sterling when she was barely out of her teens. But Thomas also began noticing inconsistencies that his engineering mind couldn't ignore, details that suggested Victoria's story was more complex than she was revealing. Financial records showed massive transfers to accounts he couldn't trace. Security footage revealed late-night meetings between Victoria and men he didn't recognize. Phone calls ended abruptly when he entered the room, leaving Victoria pale and shaken like someone who'd just received terrible news. The woman who'd hired him was clearly terrified of something, and that something seemed to be growing more dangerous by the day. Thomas found himself staying later each evening, not just because the work fascinated him, but because he sensed that Victoria needed someone to anchor her to reality. The breakthrough came when Thomas was updating the facility's security protocols and stumbled across a hidden directory buried deep in the server system, protected by encryption that would have stopped casual browsers but couldn't hide from someone with his level of access. Inside, he found documents that made his blood run cold and his engineering mind reel with the implications. Detailed plans for something called Project Phoenix, which involved the systematic transfer of Meridian's assets to offshore accounts, in a pattern so complex it would take forensic accountants months to unravel. The timeline showed the process was already underway, with $17.9 billion scheduled to be moved over the next 2 months. But what chilled him most was the signature at the bottom of each document. Victoria Sterling, CEO, written in the flowing script he'd seen her use on official paperwork. When he confronted her the next morning, Victoria's reaction told him everything he needed to know. Her face crumpled with relief and terror in equal measure, as if she'd been waiting for this moment while dreading it with every fiber of her being. "You don't understand," she whispered, sinking into her chair like a woman carrying the weight of the world on shoulders too small for such a burden. "I'm not Victoria Sterling. I never was." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Thomas's mind was still processing. Her hands shook as she reached for a bottle of water, and Thomas noticed that her designer facade was cracking, revealing someone younger and more frightened than the confident CEO she pretended to be. "My real name is Lily Chen," she continued, her voice gaining strength as the truth finally began to spill out like water from a broken dam. "I was a factory worker, then an engineer, barely making ends meet and dreaming of something better. William Sterling adopted me after my parents died in a car accident, saw potential in me that I didn't even know existed. But 6 months ago, someone from my past returned. Someone with enough information to destroy not just me, but everything William built over 4 decades. Her hands trembled as she pulled up files on her computer, showing Thomas photographs and documents that painted a picture of systematic blackmail more sophisticated than anything he'd seen in movies. Marcus Webb, she said, the name falling from her lips like a curse that had been poisoning her for months. He was a safety inspector who took bribes to cover up violations in Sterling's factories, violations that cost people their lives when they should have been fixed. When workers died because of those violations, good people with families and dreams, he disappeared with evidence that could have saved them. Thomas stared at the documents scattered across her desk, his engineering mind processing the implications while his heart broke for the woman beside him. She'd been carrying this burden alone, fighting a war she couldn't win and couldn't afford to lose. The full scope of Lily's situation became clear as she walked Thomas through 3 years of carefully documented extortion that read like a textbook case in corporate terrorism. Marcus Webb had returned from wherever he'd been hiding with photographs, financial records, and testimony from former workers who could prove that Lily Chen had never legally died, that Victoria Sterling was an elaborate fiction created to satisfy inheritance laws and regulatory requirements. More damaging still, he had evidence of William Sterling's bribes and cover-ups, information that would not only destroy the company, but send both Lily and her adoptive father to prison for fraud, tax evasion, and a dozen other crimes. "He's been bleeding the company dry," Lily explained, pulling up transfer records that showed a steady stream of payments to accounts Marcus controlled. 50 million here, 100 million there, always with some plausible explanation about consulting fees or technology acquisitions that no one bothers to verify. He told me it was temporary, that once he had enough money to disappear permanently, he'd leave us alone. But I realize now that he never intended to stop. He wants to own Meridian completely, and he's using me to take it piece by piece until there's nothing left. Thomas studied the timeline of transfers, his engineer's mind analyzing the pattern like a complex system with predictable failure points. "How much time do we have?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the desperation in Lily's voice. Lily's laugh was bitter and hollow, the sound of someone who'd run out of options and was now just waiting for the inevitable catastrophe. "He called yesterday morning, said he's tired of the slow approach, tired of waiting for me to transfer money in dribs and drabs like some kind of corporate allowance. He wants the remaining $17.9 billion transferred by the end of the month. All of it moved to accounts he controls in countries that don't cooperate with American law enforcement." The weight of 15,000 jobs, countless families, and an entire community's economic foundation pressed down on them both like a physical force. Thomas thought about Jake, about all the children whose parents worked for Meridian, about the ripple effects that would spread outward like shock waves from a bomb. "There has to be another way," he said firmly. But Lily shook her head with the weariness of someone who'd exhausted every option, explored every possibility, and found nothing but dead ends and trapdoors. "Marcus has planned this for years, maybe even decades," she said, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting their own death sentence. "He has evidence, witnesses, documentation that could convict me in any court in the country. The only thing keeping him from destroying everything right now is greed. He wants the money first, the revenge second." She turned to face Thomas directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You should run. Take Jake and disappear before this explodes into something that could destroy your life too." But Thomas was thinking about Sarah, about the way she'd faced her cancer with courage that had humbled him every single day, never giving up even when the doctors had run out of options and hope seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. She'd never run from a fight worth fighting, never abandoned someone who needed help, never let fear make her decisions for her. Sarah used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when life is easy," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memory and determination. "It's what they do when everything falls apart, and they still have a choice between doing what's right and doing what's safe." He met Lily's gaze with steady determination, seeing in her frightened eyes the same desperate courage he'd fallen in love with in Sarah. "We're going to find a way to stop him," Thomas said. And for the first time in months, Lily's face showed something other than fear and despair. The plan began to take shape over sleepless nights and endless cups of coffee, Thomas's engineering background proving invaluable as they dissected Marcus's scheme like a complex machine with exploitable weaknesses. The key insight came when Thomas realized that Marcus's evidence, while damaging, was also incomplete. He had proof of the bribes and cover-ups, but not the sophisticated financial structures that William Sterling had used to hide the money trail over the years. If they could prove that Marcus himself had been the primary beneficiary of those structures, they could turn his own evidence against him. But their investigation was interrupted when Marcus Webb himself arrived at the facility, accompanied by two men whose presence radiated menace like heat from a furnace. Thomas was monitoring the security feeds when he saw them approaching the facility's main entrance, and something in Marcus's confident stride sent ice through his veins like an injection of liquid fear. This wasn't a man making demands or negotiating terms. This was a predator coming to claim his prey, secure in the knowledge that victory was already assured. The three men moved with the coordination of a pack, Marcus in the lead with his companions flanking him like attack dogs awaiting orders. Marcus was smaller than Thomas had expected, probably in his 50s with thinning grey hair and the soft build of someone who'd spent years behind a desk. But there was something in his pale eyes that spoke of a cruelty that size couldn't measure, an intelligence that had been twisted into something monstrous by years of resentment and carefully nurtured hatred. He moved through the facility like he already owned it, examining equipment with proprietary satisfaction, while his companions positioned themselves at strategic points, blocking exits and creating a psychological cage. When he finally faced Lily in the facility's main control room, his smile was the kind that nightmares were made of. Polite on the surface, poisonous underneath. "My dear Victoria," he said, her adopted name dripping from his lips like acid, designed to burn away her carefully constructed identity. Or should I say Lily? I think it's time we had a serious conversation about the future of our partnership and the final terms of our arrangement. Thomas stepped closer to Lily, positioning himself between her and Marcus's companions in a protective gesture that was probably futile but felt necessary anyway. Marcus waved him off with casual dismissal, as if Thomas were an annoying insect rather than a potential threat. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? The fired janitor turned security consultant. How wonderfully appropriate. Cleaning up other people's messes seems to be your specialty, though I'm afraid this particular mess is far beyond your abilities to clean." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare, Marcus's words chosen with surgical precision to cut away Lily's defenses and expose her deepest fears to the harsh light of reality. He spoke casually about Jake, about Thomas's trailer, about how easily accidents could happen to people who interfered with business arrangements that were already concluded in everything but the final paperwork. But it was when he mentioned Emily Chen, Lily's best friend who died in the factory explosion 3 years ago, that Lily finally cracked, her carefully maintained composure shattering like glass under pressure. "Emily was going to report the safety violations," Marcus said with mock sadness, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a eulogy for someone he'd never actually cared about. "Such a conscientious girl, always worrying about her fellow workers, always trying to do the right thing, even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. Pity about that equipment malfunction that killed her and 3 other do-gooders. Of course, if certain people had minded their own business instead of playing hero, she might still be alive today." The implication hit Lily like a physical blow, her face going white as fresh snow, and she realized that Marcus hadn't just covered up the accident that killed her best friend, he'd caused it. The truth came pouring out of Marcus with the satisfaction of a man who'd been keeping secrets too long and finally had an audience worthy of his cleverness. Emily Chen had discovered evidence of the bribes, had threatened to go to federal authorities with proof that would have destroyed not just William Sterling, but the entire network of corruption that Marcus had spent years building. So he'd sabotaged the safety equipment in the factory where Emily worked, intending to create a small accident that would discredit her testimony. Instead, the explosion had been larger than anticipated, killing 4 people and burying the evidence along with their bodies. The beauty of it, Marcus continued, his voice warm with pride at his own ingenuity, was that everyone blamed Sterling automatically. Poor William was so consumed with guilt over the deaths, guilt he actually deserved for cutting safety corners in the first place, that he never questioned the official investigation or looked too closely at what had really happened. He even adopted you, dear Lily, as penance for your friend's death, thinking that taking care of Emily's best friend would somehow balance the scales. Thomas felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler under pressure. But he forced himself to remain calm, to think like an engineer solving a complex problem rather than a man watching innocent people be destroyed by evil. Marcus had made a crucial mistake. He'd revealed the extent of his crimes, including murder, and he'd done it in a facility where every word was being recorded by security systems that Marcus didn't know existed. But even as Thomas realized they had evidence of multiple felonies, including premeditated murder, he knew it wouldn't matter if Marcus killed them before they could use it. "You're going to transfer the remaining $17.9 billion tonight," Marcus announced, pulling out a tablet computer that displayed financial accounts already prepared to receive the funds. "All of it, moved to the accounts I've specified in countries that have no extradition treaties with the United States." Lily stared at the tablet with the expression of someone watching her entire world crumble into dust. 15,000 jobs evaporating into nothing, countless families destroyed by one man's greed and resentment. "If I do this, what happens to the employees? To the families who depend on Meridian for their livelihoods, the communities that will die without the economic foundation this company provides?" Marcus's laugh was the sound of breaking glass, sharp and cutting, and completely devoid of human warmth. "That's not my problem, and it's not yours either once you're in federal prison. Sterling destroyed my life systematically and deliberately. Now I'm returning the favor with interest." But Thomas was studying the facility's systems with his engineer's eye, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies like a computer processing data at maximum speed. Marcus had made another critical mistake. He'd brought his companions into a building that Thomas now knew better than anyone, surrounded by equipment that could be turned into weapons in the right hands. The question wasn't whether they could stop Marcus and his men, but whether they could do it without destroying the very thing they were trying to save. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in his quiet life as an engineer and janitor, a battle of wits and technology that played out across multiple levels of the facility like a 3-dimensional chess game. Marcus's companions moved with the efficiency of men who'd hurt people for money before, but Thomas had advantages they didn't expect. Intimate knowledge of every system in the building, control of the lighting and security feeds, and the desperate courage of a man protecting something more valuable than his own life. When the lights went out and emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in red illumination that made the facility look like the inside of a beating heart, Thomas was already moving through corridors he could navigate blind. Lily had vanished into the server room, using her administrator access to begin the delicate process of isolating Marcus's financial accounts, while simultaneously transferring critical data to secure locations that couldn't be compromised, even if the facility was completely destroyed. But Marcus wasn't helpless. He'd been planning this operation for 3 years and longer, and he had contingencies for every scenario that Thomas could imagine and several that he couldn't. Within minutes, Marcus had regained control of the main systems and begun the process of wiping servers that contained evidence of his crimes. The race became a battle between engineering minds working at the limits of their abilities, Thomas and Lily struggling to preserve evidence while Marcus fought to destroy it. Server farms hummed with the electronic equivalent of Mortal Kombat. Cooling systems strained to prevent catastrophic overheating as processors worked beyond their design limits. Thomas found himself calling on every skill he'd learned in 20 years of mechanical engineering, jury-rigging solutions to problems he'd never faced before, improvising fixes for systems that were failing in real time. But it was Jake who ultimately tipped the balance, though the 8-year-old boy never knew how crucial his innocent curiosity had been to saving 15,000 jobs and bringing a murderer to justice. Jake had built a science project about emergency communication systems, asking his father endless questions about how radios worked in disasters, how people called for help when normal systems failed. Those conversations had given Thomas an idea that Marcus never could have anticipated. Using the facility's hidden communication array, equipment designed to maintain contact with Meridian's other locations during emergencies, Thomas began broadcasting Marcus's recorded confession to every law enforcement frequency he could access. The signal was strong enough to reach federal law enforcement agencies, state police departments, and local sheriff's offices, creating a web of witnesses that Marcus couldn't possibly silence or intimidate into cooperation. The response was swift and overwhelming, federal agents, state police, and local law enforcement converging on the facility like antibodies responding to an infection. Marcus realized too late that his carefully constructed plan was collapsing around him, years of preparation undone by variables he'd never considered. A janitor who thought like an engineer, a CEO who fought like a survivor, and a communication system designed by a child's curiosity about how people call for help when everything goes wrong. As federal agents led Marcus and his companions away in handcuffs, their expensive suits providing no protection against charges that would keep them in prison for the rest of their natural lives. Thomas found Lily sitting among the servers she'd fought so hard to protect, tears streaming down her face as the weight of 3 years of terror finally lifted from her shoulders. The facility around them hummed with electronic life, data flowing through circuits like blood through veins, information processing and storing and transmitting in patterns that represented the continued existence of 15,000 jobs and the communities they supported. For the first time since Thomas had known her, Lily looked peaceful, her face relaxed in a way that made her appear years younger, as if the constant stress of fighting for survival had been aging her prematurely. The aftermath unfolded like a complex equation finally reaching its solution, each variable falling into place with mathematical precision that would have been beautiful if the stakes hadn't been so high. Marcus Webb was charged with 4 counts of premeditated murder, extortion, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes that would ensure he'd never see freedom again. The evidence Thomas and Lily had preserved not only convicted Marcus, but also revealed the existence of a broader corruption network that had been bleeding corporations dry for over a decade. Lily's true identity as Victoria Sterling was officially recognized by the courts after extensive investigation, her adoption by William Sterling validated through DNA testing and document analysis. Her right to control Meridian Industries was confirmed beyond any legal challenge that prosecutors or defense attorneys could mount. The company's stock price, which had plummeted during the initial media coverage of the scandal, rebounded stronger than ever as investors realized they were dealing with a CEO who'd risked everything to protect her employees rather than save herself. But the real transformation was more personal and harder to quantify than stock prices or legal victories, changes that couldn't be measured in dollars or documented in court transcripts. Thomas found himself appointed as Chief Security Officer for all of Meridian Industries, his engineering background and intimate knowledge of the company's systems making him invaluable in the post-Marcus era. More importantly, he discovered that protecting something larger than himself gave his life a meaning that grief had stolen and solitude had never been able to restore. Jake adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that had always amazed Thomas, moving from the cramped trailer to a comfortable house near Meridian's headquarters and thriving in a school district that could nurture his obvious aptitude for building things and solving problems. The boy seemed to understand, with the intuition that children often possess, that his father had found not just a job, but a purpose. Something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the risk of caring again. Lily threw herself into rebuilding Meridian with the passion of someone who'd almost lost everything and refused to take anything for granted again. She established safety protocols that became industry standards, created worker protection programs that other corporations studied and copied, and transformed Meridian from a simple technology company into a model for ethical business practices. Under her leadership, the company's value grew from $18 billion to $22 billion, but more importantly, it became a place where 15,000 families could build secure futures. The pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather began keeping time again, though neither Thomas nor Lily could explain exactly when it had started working. Thomas suspected it had something to do with having people worth measuring time for again, with building a life that looked forward instead of backward. He wore it every day, not as a monument to grief, but as a reminder that every second was an opportunity to build something better than what had existed before. 1 year after the night that had nearly destroyed everything they cared about, Thomas stood in his office on the 47th floor of Meridian Industries. His title was Chief Security Officer, but his real job was more complex than any organizational chart could capture. He was the guardian of something fragile and valuable. Jake burst through his office door with the enthusiasm that 9-year-olds brought to everything, his backpack trailing school papers and his face bright with the excitement of sharing his day. "Daddy, guess what we learned about in science class?" The boy launched into an elaborate explanation of gear ratios and mechanical advantage, his hands moving in animated gestures that reminded Thomas of Sarah's grace. Lily appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with the patient smile of someone who'd learned to find joy in simple moments after surviving experiences that could have destroyed her capacity for happiness. She'd changed since the crisis. Still brilliant, still driven, but softer somehow, as if confronting her deepest fears had freed her to be human instead of perfect. "How was the board meeting?" Thomas asked, though he could read the answer in her relaxed posture and genuine smile. "They approved the expansion of the Emily Chen Safety Institute," Lily replied, settling into the chair across from Thomas's desk. "Full funding for 5 new research facilities and partnerships with universities in 12 states. Emily would have loved knowing that her death led to something that could save thousands of lives." There was still sadness in her voice when she spoke of her friend, but it was the gentle sadness of someone who'd learned to honor the dead by living fully. Jake had finished his explanation of gear ratios and moved on to examining the pocket watch that sat on Thomas's desk, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the boy's excited chatter. "Why does it have 2 different speeds?" Jake asked, having noticed with the sharp observation skills that children possessed that the second hand moved normally, while a smaller sub-dial seemed to count something else entirely. Thomas exchanged a glance with Lily, both of them remembering the modifications she'd made during those desperate hours when every second had counted. "Sometimes," Thomas explained carefully, choosing words that would make sense to a 9-year-old while honoring the complexity of what the watch had come to represent. "You need to measure different kinds of time. Regular time for everyday things like school and work and meals, and special time for moments that matter more than others." Jake considered this with the seriousness that children brought to concepts they sensed were important but didn't fully understand. Like when Mummy was sick? He asked quietly, and Thomas felt his throat tighten with familiar emotion. Yes, Thomas said softly, pulling Jake onto his lap with the gentle strength that had become second nature. Like when Mummy was sick, and every minute we had together was precious because we knew our time was limited. But also like now, when we're building something good together, and every day feels like a gift we didn't expect to receive. Jake nestled against his father's chest, his small hand tracing the watch's intricate face as if he could read the story of their family in its mechanical movements. Lily watched them with an expression that Thomas was learning to recognize. A mixture of love and wonder and gratitude that seemed to surprise her every time she felt it. She'd told him once that she'd never expected to have a family, had assumed that her complicated past and dangerous secrets made such normal happiness impossible. But here they were, 3 people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate tragedies and somehow built something beautiful from the scattered pieces. "I have something to show you both," Lily said, pulling out a tablet that displayed architectural plans for a residential complex. The Sterling Family Housing Initiative. Affordable homes for Meridian employees, built with the latest safety technology and designed to grow with families over time. The first units will be ready next spring. Thomas studied the plans with his engineer's eye, noting the innovative design elements and sustainable building practices that would make the homes both beautiful and practical. The project represented everything they'd been working toward. Not just corporate success, but human flourishing, not just profit, but purpose. "It's perfect," he said, meaning more than just the architectural details. This was how healing looked when it was applied on a community scale. The transformation of tragedy into hope, the conversion of loss into legacy. Emily Chen's death had led to safety innovations that would protect countless workers across multiple industries. Her sacrifice becoming the foundation for regulations and technologies that would prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. Sarah's love lived on in the way Thomas approached every challenge with patience and determination, her gentle strength providing the emotional foundation that allowed him to protect and nurture others. Even Marcus Webb's crimes, in their exposure and punishment, had created opportunities for justice and reform that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The pocket watch ticked steadily on Thomas's desk, its sound barely audible above the hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of a building full of people working toward something larger than themselves. Thomas had learned to hear music in that steady rhythm, not the desperate counting down of time running out, but the hopeful marking of moments that added up to a life worth living. Each tick was a second they'd survived, each tock a promise that the next second was coming whether they were ready or not. Or Jake had fallen asleep against Thomas's chest, his breathing deep and even, his small body completely relaxed in the security of his father's arms. Thomas shifted carefully to avoid waking him, marveling at the weight of trust that children placed in the adults who loved them, the complete faith that tomorrow would come and bring new adventures and opportunities for growth. This was what they'd been fighting for, not just corporate profits or personal vindication, but the simple right of children to sleep peacefully in their father's arms while mothers looked on with love in their eyes. "He's getting so big," Lily whispered, reaching over to smooth Jake's hair with the tenderness of someone who'd learned that family wasn't just about blood connections, but about choosing to love and protect each other every single day. Thomas nodded, remembering how small Jake had seemed in those first terrible months after Sarah's death, how the boy had seemed to shrink along with their world until it felt like they might both disappear entirely. But here they were, not just surviving but thriving, not just enduring but building something beautiful and lasting. The $18 billion empire was safe, but more importantly, the people it served were flourishing, communities were strengthening, and futures were being built on foundations solid enough to support dreams that previous generations could never have imagined possible. Sometimes the best victory wasn't just saving what you had, but transforming it into something better than anyone had dared to imagine. And sometimes the most unlikely heroes were those who'd already learned that losing everything could be the beginning of finding something worth fighting for. Success, Grace had learned, wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in moments of connection, in the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful, in the certain knowledge that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely and without condition. The innocent observation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither adult was quite ready to address directly. But as they stood together in that tournament hall, surrounded by chessboards and the echoes of a hard-fought victory, Madison Clark and David Miller both realized that some games change everyone who plays them, and that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody keeps score of. 6 months after David Miller's tournament victory, Madison Clark found herself in an unfamiliar position, sitting in the bleachers of Riverside Elementary School's multipurpose room, watching Emma perform in the 3rd grade spring concert while trying to process how completely her life had changed since that first chess game at the community center. David sat beside her, wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn to their first meeting, though now it was by choice rather than necessity. His tournament winnings and subsequent sponsorship deals had provided financial stability, but he had chosen to maintain the simple lifestyle that had sustained him and Emma through their most difficult years. Success, he had learned, was about having enough rather than having everything. Emma's clear soprano voice carried across the room as she sang her solo in Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and Madison felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Watching this confident, joyful child perform with such natural grace, it was hard to imagine the scared little girl who had spent weeks in the hospital, or the father who had sat vigil beside her bed while his world crumbled around him. "She's incredible," Madison whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady at normal volume. David nodded, his eyes never leaving Emma as she moved through the choreography with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only children possess. "Sarah always said Emma would be a performer," he said quietly. "She used to sing lullabies that could make Emma stop crying instantly, even when she was a baby." It was the first time in months that David had mentioned his late wife, without the shadow of pain that usually accompanied such references, and Madison realized that somewhere in their journey together, he had found a way to honor Sarah's memory without being imprisoned by it. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed from a weight that held him down into something more like a compass that pointed him toward what mattered most. The concert concluded with all the children singing together, their voices blending in the kind of imperfect harmony that parents find more beautiful than any professional performance. As the audience applauded and families began gathering their children, Madison became aware of the other parents glancing in their direction with curious expressions. She and David had become something of a local celebrity couple, though neither of them was entirely comfortable with the attention. The chess world had embraced David's comeback story with enthusiasm, and Madison's role as his sponsor and partner had generated its own media interest. Several magazines had run features about their relationship, though they had been careful to keep the focus on David's professional achievements rather than their personal lives. "Daddy! Madison!" Emma ran toward them with the breathless excitement of a performer who had just conquered the world. Her costume, a sparkly blue dress that she had helped choose, caught the gymnasium lights as she moved, making her look like a small star who had temporarily descended to earth. David scooped her up in a hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "You were amazing, sweetheart. That solo was perfect." Emma beamed at the praise, then turned to Madison with an expression that had become familiar over the past months, the look of a child who had claimed an additional adult as family. "Did you hear me sing the Rainbow Song? I thought about Mommy when I sang it. because Daddy says she's somewhere over the rainbow now." Madison felt tears threaten at the casual way Emma had learned to integrate her mother's memory into her daily life, turning loss into something that enhanced rather than diminished her joy. "I heard every note," Madison said. "Your mommy would be so proud of you." As they prepared to leave the school, several other parents approached with congratulations about Emma's performance and questions about David's next tournament schedule. Madison watched him handle the attention with the kind of gracious professionalism he had developed since returning to competitive play, but she could see the slight tension in his posture that suggested he was still adjusting to being a public figure again. The drive home took them through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, past the community center where they had first met, and the elementary school where David still occasionally worked as a substitute teacher. Emma chatted from the back seat about her classmates' performances and her plans for summer vacation, her voice providing a cheerful soundtrack to the comfortable silence between the adults. "I've been thinking," David said as they pulled into Madison's driveway, a ritual that had developed over months of shared dinners and homework supervision and chess lessons. About what comes next. Madison felt her stomach flutter with anticipation mixed with anxiety. They had been carefully avoiding conversations about the future, focusing instead on the day-to-day reality of building something neither of them had expected to find. "What kind of thinking?" David turned off the engine and looked at her with the same focused intensity he brought to critical chess positions. "I've been offered a spot in the U.S. Championship qualifying cycle. It would mean more travel, higher stakes, the kind of pressure I walked away from 5 years ago." Emma had gone quiet in the back seat, and Madison realized that she was listening to the conversation with the sharp attention of a child who understood that adult decisions could change everything about her world. "And?" Madison prompted, though she thought she could guess the direction of his thoughts. "And I keep thinking about what you said at the hospital, about helping Emma know that her father is a hero. I want her to see that choosing love doesn't mean giving up on excellence, that you can honor the people you've lost by becoming the best version of yourself." Madison nodded, understanding both the ambition and the fear in his voice. "But?" David smiled, the expression carrying all the wisdom he had gained from loss and recovery and learning to hope again. "But I also want her to know that the most important victories happen when the people you love are there to share them with you." Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward between their seats. "Daddy, are you asking Madison to marry you? Because if you are, you're supposed to ask me first if it's okay, and then you have to give her a ring." The directness of the question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Madison's heart race, and David's face flush with embarrassment. They had been moving toward this conversation for months, but Emma's innocent intervention had accelerated the timeline considerably. "Actually," David said, reaching into his jacket pocket with the kind of careful movement that suggested he had been planning this moment. "I was getting to that part." He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple diamond ring that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the car windows. "Madison Clark," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence he had shown during their first chess game. "You taught me that it's possible to build something new from the pieces of what you've lost. Will you marry me and help me teach Emma that love is the only game worth winning?" Madison stared at the ring, processing the magnitude of what David was offering. Not just marriage, but partnership in raising Emma, integration into a family that had learned to find joy after devastating loss, the chance to build a life based on love rather than achievement. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how quickly and certainly the word came. "Yes, of course. Yes." As David slipped the ring onto her finger and Emma cheered from the back seat, Madison realized that she had finally found the victory that mattered most, not defeating opponents or accumulating wealth or proving her superiority, but joining a family that had taught her the difference between winning and being happy. Emma's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Does this mean I get to call you Mom now? Because I've been practicing, and I think you'd like it." Madison looked at this extraordinary child who had somehow claimed her heart as completely as her father had, and realized that some games truly do change everyone who plays them, and that the best victories are the ones where everybody wins. "I would love that more than anything in the world," Madison said, pulling Emma into a hug that felt like coming home. As they sat together in the car, three people who had found each other across circumstances that should have kept them apart, David Miller reflected on the strange mathematics of love, how losing everything had somehow led him to gain more than he had ever dared to hope for. But Emma, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about the most important things, had the final word. "I knew you were going to be my mum from the very first day we met you. Daddy just took a long time to figure it out because grown-ups are sometimes slow about the obvious stuff." And as they laughed together in the fading afternoon light, Madison Clark and David Miller both understood that their greatest victory had nothing to do with chess, and everything to do with learning that the best moves in life are the ones that bring people together rather than defeat them. Some games, after all, are won not by checkmate, but by finding the courage to say yes to love when it appears in the most unexpected places, even if it comes disguised as a challenge from a CEO who thought she knew everything about winning, and a single father who taught her what it really means to play for keeps.